The winter of 1944 was one of the darkest in Europe's history. Nazi Germany, once a terrifying force across the continent, was now on the defensive. In the east, the Red Army advanced relentlessly toward Berlin. In the west, American and British forces pushed steadily across France and Belgium. The Reich was being squeezed, step by step, from both directions. But Adolf Hitler was not ready to surrender. Instead, he conceived one last gamble: a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest, the same corridor that had brought him victory in 1940. If it worked, it would split the Allies, capture Antwerp, and perhaps force a peace on Germany's terms. If it failed, it would consume the Reich's last reserves. Hitler summoned his generals to a secret conference. Before entering, their weapons were taken away. Sidearms, pistols, even daggers were confiscated. It was a humiliating ritual meant to ensure obedience. This was not a debate. This was an order. To prepare, the German High Command moved men and machines in secrecy. Over 10,000 railway wagons carried tanks, artillery, and soldiers toward the Ardennes. Trains ran by night, hidden by day beneath forest canopies. Columns of vehicles filled the frozen roads, inching forward under strict silence. Fuel, ammunition, and supplies were stripped from other fronts to feed this one last strike. For Hitler, it was all or nothing. A throw of the dice. Victory would mean survival. Defeat would mean the end. Historians remain divided about this decision. Some call it reckless and doomed. Germany lacked fuel, had weak logistics, and could not sustain a prolonged fight. Others argue that if surprise had been complete, and if Bastogne and Antwerp had fallen, the Allies might have fractured. The gamble, though desperate, still carried a small chance of success. And so, in the frozen forests of Belgium, Hitler placed everything he had left: his last tanks, his last fuel, and the lives of his last fighting men. The stage was set for one of the most brutal battles of the Second World War. When Hitler planned his last great offensive, he placed his faith in what he believed were Germany's finest troops. At the front of the attack stood the 1st SS Panzer Division. Born from Hitler's own bodyguard, this unit had grown into an armored formation feared across Europe. Its name carried weight, a symbol of fanaticism and battlefield skill. Beside them marched the Volksgrenadiers. They were a desperate mix of young boys, old men, and wounded veterans recalled to service. Armed with Panzerfausts and rifles, they were expected to fill the gaps and follow the steel spearhead of tanks. Germany's weapons were formidable. The Tiger tank, heavy and almost invincible from the front. The Panther tank, faster, with a deadly high-velocity gun. These machines were meant to smash through the thin American lines. For the Ardennes offensive, they received priority: fuel, ammunition, and the best roads. Every resource was funneled into their advance. On the other side stood the United States Army. The 99th Infantry Division, young and inexperienced, manned the snowy forests. The 101st Airborne, the famous paratroopers, held key crossroads, and waiting further south was General George S. Patton's Third Army. Equipped with Sherman tanks, bazookas, and artillery, his men were trained to move fast and strike hard. Patton himself was larger than life. He was flamboyant, demanding, and ruthless with weakness. But he inspired his men with confidence. Many believed that no obstacle could stand in his way. When the German attack began, Patton's army would be asked to do the impossible: wheel north in winter and rescue Bastogne. But myths surround both sides. The Waffen-SS, often described as elite, had already been bled dry on the Eastern Front. Many of its best officers and veterans were gone. Its strength was more reputation than reality. Even the mighty Tiger tanks often broke down or sat idle, empty of fuel. And Patton, too, has been cast in legend. Some historians remind us of his flaws. He had stumbled in Sicily. He clashed with fellow generals and faced criticism at home. The victory at the Bulge, they argue, was not his alone, but the result of countless soldiers holding the line. The clash between the December 16th, 1944. The Ardennes lay quiet under a blanket of snow. The forests were still, the roads frozen, the sky heavy with fog. At dawn, that silence was shattered. Over 1,500 German artillery pieces roared to life. Explosions ripped through the icy ground. For the American soldiers manning the front, it felt as if the earth itself had erupted. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. The fog was Germany's ally. It grounded Allied aircraft, the very weapon that usually dominated the battlefield. Radar screens were blind. Reconnaissance planes never left the ground. Without their air power, the Americans were forced to fight in the dark. Through the smoke and haze, the 1st SS Panzer Division advanced. Tanks rumbled down narrow roads. Infantry slipped between the trees. Their target, the thin lines of the 99th U.S. Infantry Division. Most of its soldiers were young and inexperienced, and now they faced Germany's most feared troops. The attack was sudden and overwhelming. Communications broke down. Radios went silent. Orders could not reach the front. Rumors replaced facts, and panic spread faster than commands. In the snowy woods, American Sherman tanks struggled against German Panthers and Tigers. Their armor was too thin, their guns too weak. Foxholes filled with frightened men as shells rained down. Yet many fought back stubbornly, holding crossroads and bridges longer than anyone expected. Their sacrifice slowed the German advance, buying precious time. But confusion plagued both sides. German commanders argued over orders. Should bridges be destroyed or preserved? Should American prisoners be taken or executed? Contradictions and hesitation delayed their progress. Still, on that first day, the Germans surged forward. The fog shielded them. The Americans were reeling, scattered, and blind. It seemed Hitler's gamble was working. But hidden in the chaos was a greater truth. The Ardennes offensive had begun with power and surprise, yet cracks were already forming beneath the snow. Would the spearhead of steel break through to Antwerp, or would scattered American resistance prove far stronger than expected? December 17th, 1944. The Ardennes offensive had entered its second day, and now its darkest chapter was about to unfold. Near the Belgian town of Malmedy, American prisoners of war were rounded up in a snowy field. They had surrendered after heavy fighting, expecting to be sent to the rear. Instead, SS troops opened fire. 84 Americans were cut down in cold blood. The Malmedy massacre shocked the Allied front. News spread quickly. What began as fear turned into fury. "Remember Malmedy!" became a battle cry. American soldiers no longer fought only to hold the line. They fought for justice. They fought for revenge. At the same time, the small Belgian town of Bastogne became the focus of the German drive. The 101st Airborne Division was surrounded, cut off on all sides. Supplies ran low, ammunition scarce. The paratroopers faced hunger, freezing cold, and relentless German assaults, yet they refused to yield. When German officers demanded surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe gave his legendary reply. One word: nuts. That single word became a symbol of defiance. To keep Bastogne alive, American aircraft braved flak and weather. C-47 Dakota planes dropped thousands of supply bundles. Food, ammunition, even small Christmas packages fell from the sky. On Christmas Eve, trapped soldiers opened chocolate and letters from home. In the middle of war, they found a piece of hope. Relief was on its way. General George S. Patton turned his entire Third Army north. In the dead of winter, through snow and ice, his tanks advanced at incredible speed. By December 26th, Patton's men broke through to Bastogne. The siege was lifted, the town had survived, and the German timetable was broken. But brutality was not one-sided. In the Belgian village of Chinon, American troops executed German prisoners. 70 to 80 men were killed. Unlike Malmedy, this massacre was hidden, unspoken, and ignored by high command. Some believe Patton himself avoided addressing such events to protect his army's reputation and his own legacy. The Ardennes had become more than a battlefield. It was a place where the lines between justice and vengeance. By late December, the momentum of Germany's offensive had begun to fade. The 1st SS Panzer Division, once driving forward with force, now stalled on frozen roads. Tanks sat idle, their engines silent, not from enemy fire, but from lack of fuel. Miles of vehicles clogged the narrow lanes of the Ardennes. Convoys jammed together, unable to advance, unable to retreat. The Americans, once thrown into chaos, regained their strength. General Patton's Third Army hammered into the German flanks. Sherman tanks struck at crossroads and bridges. Though weaker than Panthers and Tigers in single combat, their speed and numbers turned the tide. Each day, the German timetable slipped further. Bastogne, the town Hitler needed, remained in American hands. Its defense, and Patton's relief, made it a symbol of Allied determination. Germany's plan to divide the Allies was crumbling, but the offensive revealed the Reich's desperation. The Volksgrenadiers were filled with teenagers and old men, some barely able to carry their weapons. They were thrown into the snow against seasoned American divisions. The myth of an unstoppable German war machine gave way to the reality of a crumbling army. The retreat was chaos. German vehicles collided on icy roads, tanks slipped into ditches, trucks were abandoned when fuel tanks ran dry. With the skies clear, Allied aircraft returned. They strafed convoys, set vehicles ablaze, and turned the Ardennes into a graveyard of steel. Historians still debate the what-ifs. What if Bastogne had fallen before Patton arrived? Could the Germans have prolonged the war, perhaps forcing a stalemate? Others argue the offensive was doomed from the start. Hitler's rigid orders demanded relentless advance. No pauses, no regrouping. Units pressed forward without fuel, without supplies, and without hope. By early January, the bulge in the Allied lines had been erased. The SS divisions limped back toward Germany, leaving wreckage in the snow. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last gamble, had failed. The truth behind the steel line was clear. Germany no longer had the resources, no longer had the strength, and by January 1945, the Ardennes offensive was over. What Hitler called his final gamble had failed. Germany had thrown in its last reserves of men, fuel, and steel, and in return, it gained nothing but loss. From that moment, the Reich would never launch another major offensive. The Battle of the Bulge marked the end of Germany's ability to attack. From then on, it could only retreat. The road to Berlin lay open. For the United States, the Ardennes became a defining story. Bastogne stood as a symbol of defiance. When the Germans demanded surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe answered with a single word: nuts. That one word captured the spirit of resistance. It echoed through history as a reminder of courage under impossible odds. The battle also shaped American strategy for years to come. The shock of the surprise attack left a deep scar. It created a belief in permanent vigilance, a conviction that complacency was as dangerous as the enemy itself. During the Cold War, generals would often point to the Bulge as proof that threats can strike when least expected. But the legacy is not without controversy. In books and films, the Waffen-SS was often portrayed as terrifyingly elite. Patton was celebrated as the lone savior of the Ardennes. Yet modern historians challenge these myths. The SS by late 1944 was weakened, its veterans gone, its fuel and supplies scarce, its reputation more myth than reality. And Patton, though bold and brilliant, was not alone. The victory belonged not just to him, but to countless unnamed soldiers, men who held crossroads, who fought in foxholes, who froze in the forests of Belgium. Some ask, did America claim ownership of the story? Did the legend of victory overshadow early mistakes and heavy casualties? Did propaganda shape memory more than truth? The Battle of the Bulge was both tragedy and triumph, a place where myths were born and where myths still cloud reality. It was a desperate gamble, a brutal clash, and a turning point in the Second World War. And yet, questions remain. What if Bastogne had fallen? What if Allied intelligence